All right. Well, as that announcement said, we know it's recording. Well, thank you everyone for coming out tonight. We appreciate it. And we want to be respectful of your time, especially on this beautiful summer night. So I'm Mayor David Pileski, and tonight we're going to cover our Investing in Infrastructure Community Forums. This is our third in a series that we're hosting since March to help educate the community on our infrastructure needs and options that you as residents can make a decision on for how we fund these things going forward. Before we get started, I want to recognize we have a number of our board members here tonight with us. So in the back, we have Trustee Dahl, Trustee Prokowski, Trustee Forsyth, Trustee Domke, and Trustee Trejo with us as well. Trustee Lenise is at a Arts and Culture Foundation meeting across the street, so she may be joining us a little bit later tonight. Also with me up here tonight presenting information will be our Finance Director, Tom Dahl. So he's been with the village for a number of years, and so we'll accept his sage financial wisdom as we start to get through some of these options ahead of us. So for those of you who may or may not have been at our prior forums, we just wanted to give a quick recap. Why do we need an increased funding to support our infrastructure here in the village? And so right now, if we look at our wastewater and our water system, so what delivers water to our faucets and what takes that when it goes through our drains, we have $80 million of projects over 5 years that we are mandated to do by the Illinois EPA. These are things that are unfunded mandates that are coming to us from the state that we have zero control over how we can address these things. They provide us some tools to solve these problems, but those come in the form of loans that we still have to pay back and find revenue sources to do that for. So while we don't need $80 million in our bank account today, we still would need about $4.5 million of additional revenue per year to pay off the principal of those loans. We also know that we have aging water treatment facilities, and we also have seen increased demand over time, which is a good problem to have. But in order for us to continue to accept new businesses and other entities into the village, we have to expand the capacity of our water treatment facilities in order to keep up with what we're seeing from that side of things. The other thing that we're dealing with is also lead service line replacement regulations. So the village, if you've driven around, it's hard to miss what's happening on West Maple Avenue right now. That's actually our first lead service line replacement project today in the village. We've got about 200, 250 addresses that have a lead service line that's impacted by this, a mixture of both residential as well as commercial, but we're working on that project as well. But those have a lot of expenses for us that we have to incur and find opportunities in order to pay for those. We also know stormwater is a big issue in this community. So we've had a number of big storms over the past week, and we've seen and felt that firsthand, not only from the wind, but just what happens when there's so much rain hitting our system all at once. Right now, the good news is we've been in the process of doing a number of studies. And so you can see that on the screen. We've done the Central Meacham Creek study area, the Devlin study area, and the Seasons 4 study area. Those are all highlighted in red on the screen. We're all either a part of really the Meacham watershed, the Springbrook Creek watershed, or the West Branch DuPage County River watershed. And so these studies help us understand how could we address the flooding that happens either on private property, through our roads and whatnot. A lot of these projects, of course, cost a lot of money. We're estimated to have about $30 million worth of projects right now, and those are just for those 3 study areas. Obviously, there's other areas we need to get to as a part of that. The good news, at least with stormwater, is unlike before with these being unfunded mandates, there's a lot of grants and other funds available for that because we're trying to prepare our communities to be more resilient, and that's a priority of the federal government. So we feel fairly confident. It might take us a little bit longer, but these are things that we think we can find funding for over the long term. Streets and sidewalks are also an important thing that we have to do in this village. We have over about 75 miles of streets that we're specifically responsible for paving and maintaining throughout the year. And so this chart here, it's showing the rating of a street condition. So this is a industry-wide use to kind of help understand what qualifies as a good road versus a bad road. The area that's shaded in yellow, which is kind of difficult to see on the TV, is anything above 67 is usually what we would consider a good condition road. It's not on a scale of 100, so it doesn't really make a lot of logical sense necessarily. But what this shows us, though, is right now our current funding levels at $1 million a year, that's that red line. We're going to see incremental decreases in the quality of roads starting as soon as 2025. If we were to increase that even by $750,000, we would see that decline still happen, just delayed. What we really have seen through our forecasts and looking at our streets is that we really need to double at least our funding for streets in order to maintain the quality. but really spend upwards of $1.25 to $1.5 million extra a year in order to see that improvement continue to improve in the village overall. We also know that we have a lot of aging sidewalks as well as gaps in our walking paths. And we do budget historically about $100,000 for sidewalks. But as you can imagine, with inflation and just other things that go on in the economy, that $100,000 is getting not taking us as far as it once did, as far as replacing sidewalks, implementing new sidewalks, or filling in those holes that do occur in our system. So looking at it overall, when we talk about infrastructure, there's 4 real things that are driving where we're at today and why we're having this conversation. One is unfunded mandates that we're getting from the EPA and other agencies and government. Well, I think we all agree we would like to have clean water, and that's an important thing that we need to protect. That comes at a steep cost. And so without having the resources allocated to communities like ours, we're left to kind of find how do we make this work from us from a financial standpoint. The second thing, and it seems kind of counterintuitive, but the village has always been very conservative in its budgeting. What I mean by that is we always lived within our means. If we didn't have money to do a project, we would defer it. If we needed to take more time to save up funds, we would do that. But the problem is when we've done flat annual funding or deferred maintenance, that comes at a greater cost later on to residents. And so we're having these bigger issues that we're trying to find right now that we want to make sure that we're setting ourselves up for the future where we can avoid some of these bigger problems because we were able to address them on time. The other thing is just naturally, our community had a huge population growth in the 70s and the 80s. And so many of the houses, many of the families that live in our community came to us at that point in time. But with that big construction boom, we have a lot of aging infrastructure that's hitting that 50, 60-year mark now. And so that's going to create a lot of demands on us in the next couple of years for us to have to maintain and continue to take care of. And then finally, something that we've all been feeling, and it's easing up a little bit, but inflation and increased costs are a real factor for us. It has increased labor costs. It has increased the supply to get things done, even the availability of products in order to purchase to do projects. It's delayed our ability to kind of tackle projects, but also we're seeing our dollars stretch not as far as it once did. When we try to address all those different issues, right? We talked about wastewater, water systems, streets, sidewalks, stormwater. Really what we're talking about is we need to see about $6 million of additional revenue annually for the village of Roselle. About $4.5 million to cover the principal on loans to upgrade our wastewater treatment plant over 20 years, as well as an additional $1.5 million to make sure our streets and our sidewalks continue to keep pace and improve upon over time. And that's gonna be the numbers that we're gonna kind of focus on and come back to as we start to talk about our solutions. So before we get to some of the solutions, I know there's a lot of different things that people say. Like, it's frustrating that we're in this situation, and I'm a neighbor just as much as you are. I was born in this town, I live in this town, and so it's frustrating to find out, well, why aren't things working correctly? There's got to be a better way to fix this, right? And so I think it's really easy to say, why can't we just increase sales revenue? Why can't we grow our sales tax base to cover this expense? And so today we get about $4 million worth of sales tax revenue. It takes about $400 million worth of sales to generate that revenue for us. So in order to grow our sales tax revenue by $6 million or $8 million total, we would need to have about 11 Walmarts open up in the village of Roselle. And we can all agree there's no space for that to happen, but also it's unrealistic for us to attract that volume of business to the community to make up for this deficit purely by growing our economy. The other thing is, well, why can't you, if you don't have the money, just cut service design, start to cut the budget in order to make that up? So we don't fund our, which we'll hear about later, our infrastructure through our general fund, but that's our one funding tool that we can go through to actually save money. That'd be about a 20% cut in our general fund. The general fund pays for all of our personnel, our pension expenses, as well as contractual services. So for us, in order to cut the budget in a way that would save us the $4 million we need, we'd be seeing about a 20% reduction in our staff or eliminating all of our contractual services in its entirety. That would include snow removal, paramedic services, mosquito abatement, and street maintenance. So I think there would be substantial changes to the way that we function as an organization by cutting 20%. And that's not something that we see as something that's viable or feasible for us in order to accommodate this kind of funds. The other question is, well, why can't we just grow Roselle to get 25,000 residents so we can get home rule, right? And I think there's a lot of myths out there. The village accepted Metro 19 and we're constantly looking for apartments we could grow to 25,000. And I can tell you, absolutely, there's no way the village is going to realistically grow to 25,000. There's no massive campaign to grow the village to 25,000. That would tax us and our services and what we would have to deliver. But also it would change the fabric of our community in a very big way. In order to get to 25,000 residents, we would have to construct 6 Metro 19s, and that thing is still being constructed. So you can imagine that would take us years to get to that point, and that would add 3,000 residents that then we would have to take care of in other ways and means. And so growing to 25,000 has been floated out there as a way that we could raise money or funds, but that's also, again, not something that's really viable. To put in perspective, the downtown area that was constructed over the early 2000s, it took us 22 years to grow 3,000 residents in that area of town. So that's how much time it takes for a community of our size to absorb and build a population. So where we're at today, and I think this is a very sobering place to be, but we're being very transparent as an organization with our community because we think this is a decision that's a community decision. It's not a board decision. It's not for staff to make the decision. It's for us as community members to be responsible and take charge and make sure that we feel comfortable with the path we're going to go forward on. And so when I look at it, there's really these 3 competing ideas. Some of us want low density, want the community to remain as a very nice bedroom community. People would like to have lower taxes. And we also want to have stable, high quality public services, right? We want the police to come immediately. We want to have good fire and paramedic services. We want to have roads that are well maintained and plowed when it snows. The problem is those 3 things are in conflict with each other. If we have low density and low taxes, you have to cut services because there's no funding to support those services. If you want stable public services and low taxes, you have more density in order to generate the revenue and to offset the costs that you're not recuperating from that population. And if you have low density and high quality public services, you're going to have higher taxes because you need to be able to fund those in some way. While we want to get to the middle, it's very hard, right? We've been striving for a utopia. America itself is an experiment in and of itself, and we're trying to make it more perfect every day. And we've been at it for a long time. And I think we're still working on it. But so I think as much as we try to get to that center, that's something that we can't realistically do today, tomorrow, or maybe even in 10 years. So I think this is a way for us that we're kind of approaching it as far as what are the areas we're willing to sacrifice in order to make sure that we can continue to function and provide residents with the quality of life that they expect, as well as businesses. So as I kind of mentioned earlier, and I'm going to be turning it over to our finance director here shortly, how do we collect money and what it's used for is very important here. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about property taxes and what that goes towards. So the village's portion of an average resident's property tax bill is only 10%. And of that 10% that you pay in your property tax bill, all that goes to our general fund. And our general fund pays for personnel and contractual services. In fact, one of our biggest expenses that we're continuing to put more money towards than that is our pensions, which we had a great report a couple meetings ago. So if you want to go back and stream that meeting, I highly recommend you do that. We're making progress, but there's a lot more that we need to do to fund pensions. The way that we actually pay for our infrastructure is through utility tax, which is going through your electrical bill and other bills like that. It's coming through your capital improvement surcharge fee on your water bill, which I know is very popular with residents. That CSI fee that's been going up every year, and that's partially why, as well as the Illinois motor fuel tax, which is something that the state of Illinois collects on our behalf. We don't set the rate, the state determines that, and we get that remitted to us. And so those 3 funding sources are what help us fund infrastructure, be it for sidewalks and streets and stormwater, our water system and wastewater collection system, and then streets and bridges. So with that being the case, I'm going to turn it over to Tom to talk about what solutions we have to help us improve the funding of our infrastructure.
Thank you, Barry. So let's discuss some solutions. To raise sufficient revenue to best maintain our community's infrastructure, we have 3 solutions available to us. We'll talk about each of these in the following slides, but really to summarize, solution 1, we can increase user fees like the capital improvement surcharge and establish new utility taxes. Solution 2, we can raise revenue through a non-home rule sales tax of 1%. Or solution 3, we can become a home rule municipality and establish a sales and a motor fuel tax to fund infrastructure improvements. Relying on user fees and tax increases is something the Board of Trustees can do at any board meeting to raise revenues for infrastructure. No ballot measure is required. Non-home rule sales tax and, or home rule status would allow us to raise revenue from visitors to Roselle like surrounding communities do. But both of these solutions require passage of a local referendum. So to address our infrastructure funding needs, we have a few tools available right now that can provide the village with additional revenue. The capital improvement surcharge is used to fund the water sewer capital projects fund and provide funding for the repayment of debt issued to complete past large projects. And of the 3.1 million expected to be collected in fiscal year 23, where we're at now, approximately half will be used to pay off bonds in our IEPA loans. And the CIS is the only item on your water bill that goes towards infrastructure improvements. With no additional revenue, we would have to double and later triple the CIS rates you pay in order to reach the $4.5 million we need to cover our wastewater updates. In addition to increasing the CIS, the village could raise small amounts of revenue to better support street improvements through other user fees or tax increases. The village currently charges less than the Illinois state maximum for electric utility tax. And if we had enacted the maximum tax rate in 2022, we would have collected about $90,000 more in electric tax. And if we increased the sticker cost for a passenger car, for example, that extra $10 per vehicle could generate about $130,000 in revenue. And then finally, we could also create a municipal water utility tax, a 1% utility tax that would generate an additional $44,000 in revenue. So the village currently receives, as I said, about 3.1 million in revenue from the CIS, which funds water and sewer infrastructure improvements. We eventually will need the additional $4.5 million in revenue just to cover those mandated sewer, wastewater improvement loans that David mentioned earlier. That means we would need to more than double the current CIS rates. So this chart looks at how CIS rates would change in order to leverage that funding. If we only rely on our available tools, CIS rates would increase to $7 per thousand gallons next year, and would continue to increase until reaching $20 per thousand gallons in 2032. It's important to keep in mind that the CIS is separate from water and sewer rates. They serve completely different purposes. The CIS rate changes to fund necessary infrastructure improvements, and your water and sewer rates are established to recover the cost of purchasing water, which we resell back to residents, and to operate our water and sanitary sewer systems. Water and sewer rates will not escalate at the same rate as the CIS because water costs and operating costs will not increase as dramatically as our infrastructure improvement costs will. What do these rates mean for you? This chart shows how much an average water customer would pay in CIS per year if the village had to impose a CIS increase to pay for infrastructure improvements. So the solution one, right? Average use is 4,300 gallons per month. And each column shows the total cost for 12 months of billing over time. Without additional revenue, the average single family home could pay over $1,000 annually in CIS fees by 2032. So solution two would be non-home rule sales tax. This tax is one way we can increase revenue for infrastructure improvements from people who visit Roselle like other communities do. And adopting a non-home rule sales tax of just 1% would more than double the revenue that can be used for infrastructure improvements. So the non-home rule sales tax has a maximum rate of 1% by state statute. If we were to pass a referendum for this, we would not be able to increase the sales tax rate at a later date due to our non-home rule status. We would not be able to increase this tax if we needed to generate more revenue for infrastructure improvements. The non-home rule sales tax allows us to capture revenue from people coming into Roselle for dining, shopping, buying a car, etc. Other communities around Roselle have more ability to impose taxes that generate revenues from visitors than we do. One of the pros is adopting the non-home rule sales tax would increase funding for water and wastewater projects, the most critical need due to the federal and state mandates and the construction costs for these projects. An additional revenue has to cover this first. So the con would be the non-home rule sales tax would not generate enough revenue to cover the $4.5 million needed annually to cover those loans. It would still be accompanied by a CIS increase to help make up that difference. And then no additional funding, it would be allotted for street improvements. So here's that same chart. The CIS increase will happen no matter what, so that we can continue funding the water sewer capital projects fund. But with sales tax revenue, we can keep the rates lower over time for residents. And this chart demonstrates the impact of having additional revenue from sales tax on our CIS rate schedule. So the blue line is the same as the first chart we showed. What CIS rates would have to be to cover infrastructure improvements with no additional revenue. But the orange line shows projected CIS rates with additional revenue from sales tax. So if we increase $3.5 million from 1% non-home rule sales tax, that would get us closer to that $4.5 million minimum we need for infrastructure. CIS rates would increase much less dramatically, just 25 cents every few years after 2025. So what would these rates mean for you on your water bill? This chart shows how much the average water customer would pay in CIS fees per year if the village had additional revenues for infrastructure funding. And then when we compare that, the average CIS cost per year with additional revenue is marked in orange to the average CIS cost per year without additional revenue, which is marked in blue, you can clearly see how having additional revenue to support infrastructure affects your bottom line on your water bill. When the village is able to leverage more revenue from visitors to our community, it reduces the burden on Roselle residents. Solution 3. So what is home rule? Another way we can increase revenue for infrastructure from visitors to our community would be through adopting home rule status. Home rule grants municipalities more flexibility to address local problems with solutions tailored to their communities, such as creating new revenue streams to support community infrastructure. Municipalities are automatically granted home rule status when their population exceeds 25,000, but 2/3 of home rule municipalities in Illinois earned their status through referendum when their populations were less than 25,000. As a non-home rule community, it can be more expensive for us to borrow money to complete major infrastructure projects because there are fewer financing solutions available to us. This can increase the overall cost of our project. And finally, Roselle also has limited ability to generate revenue from people who come through town, like, as we said, like neighboring communities do. So this slide gives you an idea of the kind of tools available if we were to gain home rule status. Sales tax, local gasoline tax, and a credit upgrade are highlights. These are the most relevant to our conversation today surrounding infrastructure funding. New regulatory and policy possibilities, including licensing businesses, landlords, and short-term rental homes, just to name a few. And then even if we were to gain home rule, we would still have to abide by limitations of state law. For example, we couldn't establish a real estate transfer tax without a referendum. And as I said, 2/3 of the 221 home rule municipalities in Illinois gained their status through referendum. And in our area, most of Roselle's neighbors are home rule and earn their status by population. Bloomingdale is the exception, having gone out for referendum in 1996 to provide financing to acquire what is now the Bloomingdale Golf Club to preserve it as open space. Itasca and Wooddale are non-home rule. They have less than 25,000 residents, but Itasca does have a non-home rule sales tax, which is one of the solutions we are considering for Roselle. So to give you an idea of the kind of revenue we could generate from a home rule sales tax and a local gasoline tax, we pulled some figures from our neighboring communities. When you shop in Schaumburg, Bloomingdale, and others on the chart here, your sales tax goes to those communities. The outline section on the chart shows the sales tax rates those communities have imposed and the millions of dollars of revenue that they generate from residents and visitors just like you. The same is true for buying gas. When you purchase gas in a community with an additional local gas tax, you are helping pay for their roads. Roselle could do more to capture revenues from visitors like these communities and put our community on a more level playing field. So as an example, here's a chart with 1.5% sales tax and 3 cents per gallon local gasoline tax. These two taxes could generate the amount of revenue we need for infrastructure improvements. Because a 1.5% sales tax would generate more than the $4.5 million needed for wastewater improvements, the additional funds could be reallocated to other areas of infrastructure. So in this scenario, we'd gain an additional $750,000 for street improvements and combine that with the $300,000 earned from a 3-cent gasoline tax, we could reach the $1 million for street funding. This would allow us to improve more streets per year and preserve Roselle's overall pavement condition. So what is the real cost of that impact? So when you fill a $15 gallon tank of gas, that would generate 45 cents towards streets. And spending $100 on qualifying expenses would generate $1.50 towards our infrastructure. Home rule FAQs, and I'll hand that back to David.
Thank you, Tom. So as we kind of go through it, I know home rule has, it can be very confusing and it feels very bureaucratic and it can sometimes feel like it has a lot of authority and power with it, and it does. But I think what's important is it gives you a stronger local voice. I'm literally your neighbor. I live down the street. You can see me at all of our events. You can talk to me. You can vote for me or not vote for me for that matter. And you can reach all of your trustees at any given point in time. As much as I would like to think our elected leaders in Springfield are accessible, I don't know the last time I got to talk to the governor for more than 2 seconds. And that was prearranged by an organization for me. So I think the whole idea is you have more input locally with us to be able to make rules that make sense for Roselle instead of having a lot of things dictated to us by the state. The other thing, and it seems maybe counterintuitive, but I know we're very sensitive about property taxes. And while the village only takes up 10% of your property tax bill, and we would not increase property taxes to solve this problem, this helps us become less reliant on property taxes overall. Because as we diversify where we can receive revenue streams from, we're able to then mitigate risk. And so as the markets fluctuate, things change, we don't have to be overly reliant on increasing our property taxes as much because we have other means of getting funding. A lot of those communities that have home rule status that we just walked through, many of them have held property tax levies flat over the past couple of years because they had other revenue streams to help them do that, as an example. Now, does home rule affect taxes on real estate transactions? As we covered earlier, that's something that we could never do on our own. That would require us going to voters and getting authorization approval on. And that's something that, again, we're your neighbors too. People oftentimes move in town and whatnot. We wouldn't want to impose that on ourselves as well. I think that's something that, we understand what's going on. And if the community's needs ever change and evolve, that's something we definitely would want to hear from our community on. But that's not something that we're considering here today. What we really think is important is having the ability to set a sales tax and a motor fuel tax so that way we can adjust our funding as needed so we can get projects done instead of deferring or trying to find expensive ways to finance these and burden the next generation with how to pay for that. So, and I think the other thing is home rule. We're always here, as I kind of highlighted earlier, we have our board meetings on the 2nd and 4th Mondays at Village Hall. We stream all of our meetings now. They're all posted on YouTube and everyone has an opportunity to participate in our meetings. You can submit public comment electronically or come to any meeting to talk to us. And again, I would ask anyone to show me how you have better access to Springfield to make your voice heard on issues like you do with your own local board. And so when we compare all these solutions, the thing at the end of the day is the board can really only implement solution 1 because those are using user fees that exist today. And again, as a resident who has to pay a water bill, the trustees all have to pay water bills, We don't want to increase the water bills like that. 2 to 3 times, I have family members, my aunt is in town, she's on a fixed income. I would not want to increase her water bill by 3 times like that. We understand that this would hurt people's pocketbooks very hard, but the reality is that's our only tool that we have at our disposal today that we can implement on our own. And so it's something that we have to do in order to pay for these loans that we will have to take out, but it's not something that we want to go to first. That's where we get to solution 2 and solution 3. But the thing is, this is the community's choice. It's not something that we can decide for the community. And so that's where residents are going to have to vote and make a decision. Would you prefer to see a sales tax in the form of a non-home rule sales tax at 1% that could help us solve a good chunk of our funding for wastewater, but not all of it? And we wouldn't be able to address the streets issue today. Or do we go for home rule status, which then gives the board the authority and the ability to implement a sales tax, as well as a gasoline tax, as well as other regulatory benefits. Some things like we could do, such as crime-free housing, requiring video cameras on the premise at rental facilities, requiring background checks. It would help us with code enforcement and other activities in that regard. Really, it gives us more ability to use our local control to make policy decisions for Roselle instead of having to use the playbook that Illinois gives us today. And so again, as a highlight, 1% sales tax for a non-home rule sales tax can only be increased by future referendum. And in that case, a 1% is the maximum there. It would only be used for infrastructure. For non-home rule, it would allow us to tax visitors. And I think that's really important to note as well. This allows us to spread the burden to everyone who uses Roselle, comes and visits our community, enjoys being here, but don't pay anything. If you drive on, I am guilty of filling up at Costco constantly. I go out and eat with family members in other communities. I'm helping pay for their roads. I'm paying for their vehicle sticker, essentially. The reason we have a vehicle sticker today is because we don't have any ability to directly raise funds to pay for our streets. And so if we had the ability to tax more efficiently, that's things that the board can then also reconsider about how do we collect our revenue, because we have more tools at our disposal. It also allows us to allocate that revenue to the diversity of needs. So we focus on a lot of things that are critical today, but we know that we're going to continue to need to focus on stormwater management. We have culverts that need to be maintained. We know that we have additional projects that we'd love to tackle, but the funding's not there. So while we address this problem that we have in front of us for the next couple of decades, we now have funding that helps us to pivot to address the needs and the concerns that tomorrow might throw to us. And so we want you to share your feedback. So we're going to have an opportunity to open up for question and answer. We have people from Public Works. If you have specific questions on infrastructure, Tom is here to answer any of your finance questions. I'm also here as well. But so we'll open up for questions. But for those of you who might not be comfortable talking to us right now, or maybe you need some time to digest the information, you can go online at the link that's provided on the screen to fill out a survey and reach out to us. We also have a QR code that you can scan. We also have a paper copy here that you could take. I will say we are going to continue to have forums. We're going to repeat this forum again in September. We know that summertime is a bad time maybe to get people. So encourage your neighbors, your family, your friends to come and join us in September when we repeat this content again. We're also going to have a coffee with the board reinstituted so we can have an informal way to communicate, talk, and answer any questions you may have. So our first coffee with the board will be on Saturday, August 5th, which is the Saturday of the Taste of Roselle. So come on up here at 10 a.m. and speak to us. We're happy to hear your feedback, and it doesn't have to be about infrastructure, be about any of your problems at all, but we'll be hosting that every other month as well on the first Saturday at 10 a.m. right here in Village Hall. So we're ramping up. We're very accessible and want to talk to you. But at the end of the day, this is a Roselle community decision. This isn't something the board can make a decision on. We can't just go up here and pass an ordinance ourselves. This is going to take our community coming together and deciding what's going to be the best fit for our community and its future. So with that being the case, we'll open up for any questions that people have. So we just ask that you speak into the microphone so that way those watching later will have an opportunity to understand what your question is.
Good evening. My name is Dahl King. I live on Rosemont and Roselle. I have one question on the home rule allows. It shows here it says sales tax can be increased in increments of 0.25%, no limit. who's to determine what no limit is? I mean, can you come up with 3%?
So
5?
yeah, no, absolutely. So I think, so to your point, that can be implemented in increments of 0.25%. There is no statutory limit on what that can be, but the board sets that and passes that at any board meeting. So we have to post public notice. We have option for the community to have input. And at the end of the day, I think there's a certain point of survival here, right? If we implemented a crazy policy, I hope you get pitchforks and you run us out of office, okay? So I think there is some accountability here that if we do something that's in the poor interest of this community, we are gonna be judged and we will be punished for that. I also patronize, and I think a lot of our trustees patronize our businesses here. We know that we have a really great, strong, unique local economy here. We don't want to put ourselves at a competitive disadvantage from other communities. So when we would set any policy, I think, I can't predict what the board would do. For right now, what we're just showing you here is 1.5 would solve our problem. The board could very easily say, we know that would solve it, but we'd rather do 1.25 because we're going to do some other thing to grow business, because we could grow our business to help cover a little bit. I think the nice thing about home rule is the board can change it. With the non-home rule sales tax, we have to go to the ballot. Let's say it passes. To change it up or down, we have to go back. And so with great power comes great responsibility, but the board can take in data, see what happens, and they could just as easily increase it as they could decrease it as well, based on what happens locally. And, projects will go out. And so, as we retire things, we have a responsibility to be transparent about what are we going to spend it on? And if we're not going to spend on something, sure as, since it's being recorded, I'll be polite, something, lower it to be accountable then. So, but that's something that the board ultimately has the power to do. So.
One other thing, I don't know if you want to discuss my street, but I was just wondering, what is the status of our street? I mean, is it even in the works? I'm thinking in another 2 years, we're not even going to have a street.
So what we're working on right now is looking at the sewer line and doing the viewing of that and collecting information to understand what's fully going on that, and not just on your street, but on the surrounding area, so we can understand similar age and quality. Is there what's going on in that regard? At this point in time, it's not budgeted for this year. I know that for sure. We are doing some patching and crack sealant, so there will be some maintenance done this year on your street. Once we get assuming the board approves the budget for next year, we do the new survey of all of our streets in the village, where we do a radio sonographic kind of study to understand both the surface and the base of everything. We'll be able to have a better idea of where racks and stacks in terms of when it would happen. The thing I will say is, if we have more funding available for streets, we can do more miles, which means right now we're touching every street for a full resurfacing probably every 20 years. If we have more funding, that's going to condense that time frame, and we can get to projects a lot quicker, regardless of, we don't want to be just triaging the worst of the worst. We should expand the scope.
I just wanted to say that, as you well know, that right up next to Lincoln there, street collapsed. And also on the block closer to Roselle Road, a car sunk. His car was literally sunk off the edge of the road. He had to have it towed out. I don't know if he ever called or what. I never seen it. My neighbors have all said, it was terrible looking. I just want to know. I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is our neighbors want to know too. Is there going to be something done? That's all I want to know.
Okay. Yeah, and we're going to continue to communicate with your neighbors, and I think we'll have some updates soon, hopefully, on that regard. So, other questions from the audience here tonight?
I'm Jeff Pito, and I live in Roselle for most of my whole life. If this does go for a referendum for the home rule, would that be on the ballot then this spring?
So the board is taking in all the feedback from these forums and listening to residents. I think it's very likely, as we're starting to put together our budget for next year, that the board is going to be asked to make a decision on what they want to do in the September-October timeframe is our hope. So if we were to do anything, the first opportunity we have is March. So I would say, given the timeframes of when we have to implement things, there will be something, without getting ahead of myself, there will most likely be something on the March ballot. Whether that is a home rule or non-home rule sales tax, I think the board is still trying to solicit opinions from the community, so that way we can put one that is trending in the right direction, we think is the best option based on community feedback. We're still evaluating if we could put both on the ballot. I think legally, that's for our attorneys to figure out for us, but also we understand this is a complicated topic, right? And I think we want to make sure that we're doing the best thing for our residents and not trying to confuse the issue. So whether or not it's both or one or the other, something I would hope would be on the ballot in March. I'm not trying to be intentionally obscure. I think we're just trying to collect your feedback to understand which is your favorite option to put forward, if that makes sense.
Source or supply for Lake Michigan water?
So there was a lot of news made of a recent hearing. So we currently have a contract that we buy our water from the city of Chicago. As a part of that it's been technically expired for a number of years, but we're operating under it. And so we're negotiating a new contract as it is. One of the clauses of our prior contract was that they had to honor the lowest rate that they were serving other people. So if you follow water news very much, Joliet is in the process of connecting and buying from Chicago. It's going to take a while for them to do so, but they gave them a really sweetheart deal on water rate that's far lower than what we pay. So when we give you a water rate, it's not something we set. We're just passing along the costs that we're getting from the city of Chicago. And so we are trying to negotiate a contract at this time, and we would hope that they would honor the Joliet pricing. There's a lot of things that go into play. So I think number one, they made a study that said that they could do that. If we were to go independently pump our own water from Lake Michigan, we're talking about a decade at least of engineering and construction in order to do that before we would get relief from a pricing perspective. Even if while we're renegotiating with the city of Chicago to get a rate reduction that would match Joliet, I would say there is questions about whether or not that would be honored at this time. It might be a couple of years before that would go in because they're not actually servicing them. It's a contract, but they're not delivering any water at that price point. So there could be some legality in terms of could we get the water rates lowered sooner than later? Obviously, if we can lower our expenses on water, that's one way that we could, keep the price the same perhaps, but then use that money where we don't feel that pain towards these types of infrastructure projects, but there's no guarantee in that. And we don't have any idea when that would be resolved at this point in time. We hope soon, but that's definitely something we're watching very closely. And that could also impact, what kind of a sales tax would we need if we could get water relief from that sense. Yeah, so I think that's a really great question. And so when we get to the wastewater side, there's not really anything to us. It's really seen as that is a service that you have to provide. We will regulate and tell you how you should provide that service, but it's your duty and your job. When it comes to like some of these other improvements like lead service lines and stuff like that, there is money out there, but it's typically for minority or impoverished communities, and we don't fit either of those kind of credentials to receive funding. So it's been very difficult. What I will say is we have been successful in other ways to save the village money for grants. So as we look at the village as a whole, we're trying to find and be more opportunistic to find ways we can find money. So we're gonna have our mid-year budget meeting next week. So that's kind of exciting. You probably don't want to come to another meeting, but I'm looking to staff. I believe our number, because I saw it, grants that we've received is somewhere close to $6 million. Yeah, $6.5 million. And that was Rottenberg Road reconstruction. That's partially funded through a grant. We still have to pay some money, but that's a huge thing that we can get money on because of the traffic that goes on that road. We can't get that for every road, but because of the type of road it's classified, we're getting that mostly paid for. And it's a really expensive road to resurface. We're also awarded a grant for a pedestrian bridge that would cross Irving Park. And that feels like a nice to have, but let me put it this way. If we're getting it paid for by the state or the federal government, that's money that we don't have, we're not spending, and it's a great asset for the community that helps us kind of move forward on it. We've also received grants for stormwater management from Raja Krishnamurthy from the federal government. And so we currently have some other applications out there for various other projects, but we've kind of found the grant money that's out there is for things that make a big splash, which I don't mean to be so nihilistic or negative, but usually they want to give you money for something they can get credit for, and they want to have a big parade and celebration around it. So we're trying to play to that so we can get what Roselle earns and deserves. We spend our money to Uncle Sam. Uncle Sam should give us some money back. But the projects that we're facing, there's just not that money. But the good news is we can then reallocate some of our other funds towards these projects we need to do. It's just not enough. Yeah. Yep. So we did actually, that's a great example of us working together. So we actually applied for a joint grant. So we were awarded together. And so we're resurfacing both sides of the street at the same time, which creates the project delays because it's two organizations and frankly, they're bigger than us, so they dictated a lot of the deadlines. But that's one way that we were able to cooperate together. That's a popular question, especially with all the trucks and whatnot and the access to the highway. And so at this time, we are not imposing a truck limit. There's also issues with enforcement on that. And so that's something that we can take offline to discuss because that's a really interesting question you bring up. So, but any other questions tonight? Well, in closing, we really appreciate you being out here. I know this is exactly what you want to do on a Tuesday night in the summer, but we appreciate you participating. We know that it's really important that we help spread the word and other people get engaged because really, like we said at the beginning, this is our community's problem and it's our community's, choice to figure out what that solution is going to be. So we want to make sure everyone's aware, they can ask their questions, and we really care about the input so we know how we move forward for that March referendum. So if you have any questions, we'll be here to answer them. Otherwise, thank you for coming, and we hope to see you at our wonderful events coming up in the village. So thank you again. Good night.